Welcome to Beyond Bitewings, the business side of dentistry, brought to you by Edwards & Associates PC. Join us as we discuss how to build your dental practice, optimize your income, and plan for your future. This podcast is distributed with the understanding that Edwards & Associates PC is not rendering legal, accounting, or professional advice. Listeners should consult with their business advisors before acting on any of the information that is shared. At Edwards & Associates PC, our business is the business of dentistry. For help or more information, visit our website at eandassociates.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond Bitewings. My name is Ash, and in today's episode, we will be talking about DSOs. One of the most common questions we receive is about selling a practice to a DSO. With DSOs rapidly expanding, they often present what seems like an ideal opportunity, allowing practice owners to cash out while stepping away from the daily grind of running a business. But while the prospect of selling to a DSO can be enticing, it's not always the right fit. These deals come with complexities, and without the right strategy, practice owners could leave a significant amount of money on the table or find themselves in an arrangement that isn't what they expected. We've had the opportunity to speak with several experts in this space, including Todd Wilson of Star Dental Partners, Brandon Moncrief, plus Robert and I have had extensive conversations about the ins and outs of DSOs. So, in this episode, Todd explains how disagreements are handled and the critical questions you should ask before signing any deal. Brandon shares why having the right representation is essential and why you should always explore multiple DSOs before making a decision. And Robert and I break down what DSOs expect from sellers, along with the risks of selling too early, and how it could cost you more than you think. If you're considering selling your practice or just want to understand the DSO landscape, this episode is packed with valuable insights you won't want to miss. Now, how do you think a DSO is able to offer much more money than, let's say, a separate independent buyer?
Well, I think it's because of the way they value the practices. Mm-hmm. They value them on a multiple of EBITDA. That's EBITDA, I believe, if I got that right. Mm-hmm. Earnings before income taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And it's basically an adjusted net income number. And they buy practices for a multiple of that instead of a fraction of collections, which is historically the way you value a practice. And that's an oversimplification, but basically practices have been known to sell for somewhere between 65 and 70 or 75% of trailing 12 months collections historically. Mm-hmm. But a DSO will come in and look at adjusted net income or EBITDA, and they'll pay a multiple of that for it. And multiples vary anywhere from 3 to over 10.
Wow.
So you might ask, what determines the multiple that they're going to pay for my practice? And it really depends on your practice. It depends on how long your practice has been around, how stable your staff is, the pay rates of your staff, the collections of your practice, the net income of your practice, because they're looking more at the net income. Because the way this all came about was private equity determined that they could earn a given return by paying a certain multiple for dental practices once they learned how to get into the service industry. And that multiple is really what it takes them to earn 12% on their money, 12 or 13% on their money. That's all they're looking for. A dentist typically earns a third of what he collects, but private equity is willing to settle for substantially less, around 12%. So that's, once you do the multiple, it's just a math calculation. It enables the price to be so much higher for them to get that 12% earnings.
I see.
And so they're paying way more for these practices than historically an entrepreneur or doctor would pay for one.
I see. And is there anything that's different about selling to a DSO as opposed to an independent buyer? I'm basically talking about what happens after the sale. Let's say the owner doctor used to actually practice the practice that he or she is planning on selling. Do they continue practicing, or do they stop practicing? Or if they do decide to practice, how long do they typically practice for, let's say, an independent buyer as opposed to a DSO?
Well, if they sell their practice to another entrepreneur dentist, an independent buyer, then basically they're going to stick around during the transition period. And the transition period for a sale from peer-to-peer is going to be somewhere around maybe 4 months, maybe 6 months. Now, I've seen one that was as long as 8 years because the seller said, I still want to work here until my youngest child graduates from college.
Wow.
And they were just starting high school. So the buyer of that practice, and it was a large practice, and it would support both doctors. Most practices won't support 2 doctors, so when one sells, he's got to kind of step aside after a period. And usually we'll put in a contract a transition period of 4 to 6 months. But generally by the end of the second month, the buyer doesn't want the seller around anymore. He's going to say, hey, go on, get out of here. Go do something else. And so that generally it's 4 to 6 months. Now that's in a sale of peer-to-peer. But if you have individual dentists selling to corporate or to group dentistry, they're going to want the seller to stay around for minimum of 3 years, sometimes as long as 5 years. And what they do to ensure that is they will quote you a very large price for your practice, as we talked about, a multiple of EBITDA. And they're going to have a very little amount of that, maybe less than 50% of that paid up front, sometimes, not every time, but sometimes. And then you've got to stick around the 5 years to earn out the other 100% or the other 50% of the sale price. So it's kind of dangling a carrot there. You leave after 3 years, then you're leaving money on the table. You leave immediately, you're leaving 50% of the money on the table. So they may offer you, double what you would get in a peer-to-peer sale, but you only get maybe as little as half of it up front and the rest of it earned out over 5 years.
And these proceeds from sales, these are on top of the salary that they would continue to make after the sale.
That's correct. Once you sell the practice, then you are basically an associate doctor, and they're going to pay you a percentage of your production, usually 30, 35%, maybe in some cases of specialist, 40% of your production.
Okay.
We saw a lot of our premier potential clients decide, rather than selling to a private buyer, to sell to a DSO. And back then, 5-7 years ago, there were very few options, Heartland being probably the largest one. And as we began to call these doctors and do what we'll call exit interviews, right? They sold to a DSO without our involvement on their own. We quickly realized that dentists didn't understand the importance of creating optionality, visiting with multiple buyers and receiving multiple offers. And they didn't understand how private equity, how DSOs view value. From a doctor to doctor perspective, value is derived more as a benchmark, 60 to 80, maybe 90% of annual revenue, or 2 times net cash flow. The DSO private equity world looks at valuation from a completely different viewpoint. They really look at valuation through the lens of EBITDA and applying a multiple of EBITDA to arrive at value. As a result, when we talk about larger practices, they can trade for 2 to 3 times in the DSO world what they would trade for in the private buyer world. So as we were talking to these doctors that had decided to go down the DSO road on their own, we discovered, one, they left a tremendous amount of value on the table, right? They weren't educated about how private equity looks at valuations. They weren't educated about how important it was to create optionality and look at different types of DSOs and different types of deal structures. And at that point in time, we realized that, hey, we can fight the good fight and try to keep private practice private and only sell practices to private buyers. But the reality is, once private equity comes into an industry, they're going to pour more and more money and resources into it, and it's not going away.
And I doubt if there's very many clients that we have, and probably very many dentists that are out there that haven't had at least a phone call from at least one DSO soliciting, their practice. So, considering that going forward that that's still happening, what should they do? Because too often what I see is they say, oh yeah, I'm interested because of the money you're offering. They don't say that. They say, yes, I'm interested and give me an offer. And then they're stuck. They go down that road. They can't see any other options. So what should they do when they get that phone call?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake that dentists make when they look at selling their practice to a DSO is responding to an unsolicited offer, right? DSOs are designed to try to create what they call proprietary leads. Essentially, they've built big marketing machines, business development teams to knock doors and send solicitations to practices with the hope that the owner is going to pick up the phone, call them, enter into what they think is a casual conversation that quickly turns into a formal conversation about selling their business. They're not educated. They don't have proper representation. And while the offer might look sexy on the surface, there are a lot of strings attached to these transactions. And oftentimes, just because an offer looks sexy economically comparative to selling to a private buyer, you don't know how good that offer could be unless you have proper representation and you shop the practice to multiple DSOs. So, the first step is to call somebody like us and have a discovery call, right? Talk about, first of all, what's your why? Why are you considering pursuing a DSO affiliation or private equity partner? What are your goals? Is it solely economic? Are you looking for administrative support? Have you tapped out your banking relationships and you need additional capital to fuel continued growth? There are many reasons why a dentist may consider, or specialist may consider, going down the DSO path, but you clearly got to define that why. We spend a lot of time with our clients getting to know them from that perspective. And then we quantify economics. All right, let's do a valuation. Let's do an EBITDA analysis. And DSOs tend to play a lot of games with EBITDA. So they may dangle a carrot and say, hey, doc, we're going to give you a great multiple on your EBITDA. We're going to give you a 7 or 8 times figure on your EBITDA. And that sounds attractive, right? That sounds at top of market. But the reality is they play games in the EBITDA calculation to drive down your EBITDA. So if they're cutting corners and not giving you credit for personal expenses, add backs, discretionary, non-recurring expenses, and they're layering in sometimes some of their own infrastructural costs, the EBITDA number they give you is going to be artificially low. So they might give you 7 or 8 times an artificially low number. Whereas if we had done the EBITDA analysis and controlled the narrative, the EBITDA could have been $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 higher, and we could have gotten potentially that same multiple. $300,000 times the 7 multiple is $2.1 million in value. So oftentimes we're able to move the needle significantly, sometimes with larger practices as much as several $1 million in value simply by controlling the narrative regarding EBITDA.
When I think even on a small practice, let's do the math, show that to the listeners. Basically, if you can increase EBITDA by, let's say, $50,000, what's that worth to them as a sale price?
Yeah. So let's just take like a, $2 million revenue practice with a 25% EBITDA margin. So it's got $500,000 in EBITDA and it's going to trade for, let's call it 7 times EBITDA. Just a $50,000 delta in EBITDA is equivalent to $350,000 in value.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So imagine, let's say you like remodeled your office or bought an expensive piece of equipment and wrote it off, and the DSO didn't give you credit for that non-recurring expense. It could cost you $350,000. And when you layer in multiple add backs of that nature, it could go up into the millions.
And it's in the DSO's best interest not to look too hard to uncover some of those add backs, right?
It's in their best interest to pay as little as they can for your practice.
Absolutely. Yep.
The easiest way to do that is to manipulate EBITDA and not be in a competitive environment. And look, I don't blame them, right? If I was a private equity investor, or if I had money invested with the private equity firm that backs that DSO, the name of the game is to buy low, sell high. So I would do the same thing if I was in their shoes, but I'm not. We sit on the sell side. We represent dentists. Our job is to ensure that you get every dollar that you deserve.
I was also thinking about the clients. that don't just own the practice, but also the building. Right. So a lot of times, when they're operating, they sometimes set up the lease agreement where it's maybe tax beneficial or, set up in a certain way which helps the owner. So going forward, when the business is taken over, do you just take over the existing lease, or is there a new lease agreement that is expected?
So we could do a lease assignment, it's called a CAA, and the acronym's escaping me right now. It's consignment agreement, assignment something agreement. I can't think of the name of it. But yes, we can do it that way, or we can create a new lease. It depends. Most doctors, I'm finding out, don't have a lease with themselves. And so if they don't have a lease with themselves, then we'll just create a new lease.
I'll vouch for that.
Yeah. And so we'll just create a new lease, and then we go through the negotiating piece of it. We find out what fair market value is in the area, and then do a lease per square foot. And then typically, we need a place to do dentistry, so we'll do a 5-year with 2 5-year renewals. So for a doctor that owns his own property, it can be mailbox money, especially if it's paid off. It can be quite lucrative because we're going to be there a while, right?
Right.
It just depends if they want to manage the business. And I always tell doctors all the time, too, if you don't want to manage it, hire a management company and let them just take 10% off the top, and you don't have to worry about anything. So I've had a few doctors take me up on that, and have done it.
Really? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, that's good.
Well, and if they're paying themselves, let's say what I call excessive rent,
Yep.
then that doesn't hurt their EBITDA, right? Because you'll add that back and just subtract fair market value.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
Okay,
exactly
good.
right. That's kind of like a little pass-through for them as they're doing it,
Yeah, because we advise them sometimes to pay themselves, enough to be sheltered by the depreciation on the building.
Right.
But that may be $50 a square foot, where the market might be $35.
Correct.
Yeah.
But they have to be aware of that. So that's a conversation that I have to have, because most of them are shocked when, the prices come back and it's not what they thought.
Yeah.
And I said, well, yeah, but you got the benefit of doing that because you owned the business. You owned
Right.
the building.
Thanks for listening today. Be sure to subscribe to Beyond Bitewings on your favorite podcast platform. For more information, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, or reach out to us on our website. You can also shoot us an email at info@eandassociates.com.